You know, usually when you look at history's greatest empires, you expect a certain kind of brutal simplicity.
Right, yeah, like a very mechanical approach to power.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at the Romans, they had the overwhelming logistical force of their legions. And the Mongols, they had the terrifying lightning-fast mobility of their cavalry. It's almost always a story of just pure, unadulterated force.
It's a top-down imposition of will.
Yeah.
You conquer a territory, you extract its resources, you enforce your laws, and, well, you crush any resistance.
Yeah.
It's an entirely utilitarian view of how power operates and really how human beings are managed at scale.
And it's clean.
Yeah.
In a very ruthless sort of way. But then you look at the Ottoman Empire, and that simple formula just completely breaks down.
It really does. It shatters it entirely.
Right. You were looking at a system that lasted over 600 years. It spanned multiple continents. And when you really look under the hood, it wasn't just held together by swords or, tax collectors.
Yeah, well, not at all.
It was held together by this perfectly balanced, almost impossible fusion of strict legal discipline, massive bureaucratic architecture, and of all things, deeply mystical poetry.
Which is arguably one of the ultimate historical puzzles of statecraft. I mean, how do you build an imperial engine that runs simultaneously on rigid, unyielding divine law and deeply emotional, transformative spiritual devotion?
It sounds like a contradiction.
And it does. How do you create a society that builds the most massive, meticulously organized administrative state of its era, but actively carves out institutional space for, like, whirling dervishes?
Well, that is exactly the operating system we are decoding in this deep dive. We are unpacking the incredibly specific, highly successful framework of Ottoman Imperial Islam.
And we should clarify, we aren't just going to walk through a timeline of famous battles or list off the names of sultans. It's not the goal here.
No, definitely not. The goal is to unpack a specific psychological worldview. We want to understand the strategic architectural blueprint that managed to fuse religious faith, sheer imperial grandeur, and pragmatic governance into a machine that survived for 6 centuries.
And to really grasp the magnitude of what they built, you have to understand the specific historical context in which this operating system was forged.
Right, because they didn't start out as a massive empire.
Exactly. The origins are relatively humble. We're starting in Anatolia in the late 1200s, specifically around 1299, with a leader named Osman I.
So just a local guy, essentially?
Basically, yeah. At this point, the Ottomans are just a regional state, a border principality dealing with local rivalries.
Yeah.
But the turning point, the moment that permanently alters the DNA of this state, happens in 1453.
When Mehmed II conquers Constantinople.
Precisely. And the psychological and administrative shock of that moment really cannot be overstated. Overnight, this regional power explodes onto the global stage.
Right, because Constantinople wasn't just any city.
No, it becomes the Islamic imperial capital, later known as Istanbul. The Ottomans are no longer just managing a homogeneous group of pastoralists and local towns.
They've got the big leagues now.
Exactly. They are suddenly tasked with managing a massive, multi-ethnic, multilingual global Islamic empire sitting right at the crossroads of Europe and Asia.
Which brings us to the core historical challenge they faced right out of the gate. The problem is fundamentally one of scale.
A massive problem of scale.
How do you govern a rapidly expanding, wildly diverse empire using purely Islamic principles?
Yeah.
You have the Sharia, right? The divine Islamic law.
Right.
Now, anyone familiar with Islamic history knows that Sharia provides the absolute moral framework. I mean, it gives you universal principles, criminal codes, guidelines for personal conduct.
But divine law deals in eternal absolutes.
Yes. It does not necessarily give you the specific hyper-local tax code required for a newly conquered Byzantine province in the Balkans.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you the guild regulations for a bustling, multi-faith commercial port in Egypt.
And that is the exact friction point that breaks most ideologically driven empires.
How so?
Well, how do you bridge the gap between universal, unchanging divine law and the incredibly messy, pragmatic reality of running a global economy?
You can't just quote scripture to fix a copper shortage.
Exactly. So the Ottomans engineered a brilliant tripartite solution to this governance puzzle. It's a 3-part legal framework. First, as you mentioned, you have the Sharia.
The divine law.
Yes, this is the unchangeable divine law. It's the absolute bedrock of their legitimacy. Second, you have the Qanun.
Qanun, okay.
This is the imperial administrative law. These are the flexible, practical, highly specific laws created directly by the Sultan to handle daily governance, taxation, and local civic realities.
Okay, and the third piece of the puzzle is the ulama.
Yes, the ulama, The scholarly authority. These are the religious scholars, the jurists, the experts in Sharia.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here to map how these three interact, because looking at the sources, it functions incredibly much like a modern technology stack.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Think of this massive empire as a complex operating system. The Sharia is your hard-coded base layer. It's the kernel of the OS. It is divine, it is perfect, and you absolutely cannot alter it, or the entire system loses its legitimacy and crashes.
Right, you can't touch the kernel.
Exactly. The Qanun, on the other hand, represents the modular software applications built on top of that base layer to handle specific, everyday tasks.
I see where you're going with this.
If you need an app to manage complex land disputes in a newly conquered Syrian province, the Sultan writes a Qanun for that. If you need a protocol for regulating the copper markets, the Sultan issues a Qanun.
And following your analogy, the ulama serve as the security protocol.
Exactly. They are the compilers. Their job is to constantly review these new modular Qanun apps and ensure that none of them contain malicious code that violates the base layer of the Sharia.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But I have to play devil's advocate here and challenge the fundamental premise of this setup.
Go for it.
If I am an observer in the 15th century and I see the Sultan just generating thousands of his own Qanun decrees to run the ports, determine tax brackets, manage the military.
It looks a bit suspicious.
Yeah. You are effectively operating a secular state disguised as a religious one. If the Sultan can just write whatever law he wants under the banner of Qanun, doesn't that inherently undermine the supremacy of the Sharia?
That's the logical question.
How did they convince anyone this wasn't just a dictator slapping a religious label on his own arbitrary will?
And that is the exact vulnerability that could have delegitimized the entire Ottoman project.
Right, because if people think he's a fraud.
Exactly. If the population, or more importantly, the military and the clerics, believed the Sultan was just bypassing divine law, the empire would have fractured into constant religious rebellions.
So how did they avoid that?
This is where we have to look at the mechanics of the specific legal tradition they adopted. The Ottomans didn't just invent this out of thin air. They intentionally favored and deeply institutionalized the Hanafi school of Sunni jurisprudence.
And the Hanafi school is distinct from other legal traditions in how it approaches problems, right?
Very much so. It draws on earlier models, specifically the administrative traditions of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Seljuk Empire. The Hanafi school is historically famous for explicitly allowing profound legal reasoning, logic, and a high degree of flexibility.
Flexibility in religious law. That sounds rare.
It is in some contexts, but Hanafi heavily incorporates concepts like juristic preference, meaning choosing a legal ruling that brings the most ease and utility to the public.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it formally recognizes local custom as a valid source of law, provided it doesn't directly contradict the text.
So they weren't locked into a rigid, literalist reading of 7th century texts when trying to solve 16th century logistical problems.
Exactly. Because of this deeply established Hanafi framework, the Sultan was not viewed as a rogue agent bypassing the law. He was viewed as the ultimate protector of Islam.
So his decrees were seen as necessary maintenance, not breaking the law.
Right. In the Ottoman worldview, the primary sacred duty of the Sultan was to maintain justice and social order. If society descends into chaos, religious practice becomes impossible.
You can't exactly pray 5 times a day if your city is burning down.
Precisely. Therefore, when the Sultan issued Qanun to stabilize the economy or secure the borders, he was actually fulfilling his religious duty to protect the community.
But he still couldn't just do it in a vacuum. He needed the scholars.
Right. Because the ulama, the scholars, had to legally validate these Qanun laws. It created an incredibly robust system of checks and balances.
A separation of powers, almost.
Yes. The Sultan possessed the political and military power to enforce the law, but the scholars held the ultimate religious authority to validate it.
Because the Sultan isn't a theologian.
Exactly. He was not a priest. He did not invent theology. He was the political defender of the faith and the patron of religious institutions. But the actual fat was, the binding religious rulings came strictly from the scholarly class.
So the politicians don't write the theology, and the theologians don't command the armies.
Right. This separation of powers was intentionally designed to protect the integrity of the religious law from pure, unadulterated political manipulation.
Now, if you are the Ottoman state and you have built this brilliant system where your entire political legitimacy rests on the approval of these scholars, you quickly realize a massive logistical problem.
Oh, a huge one.
You cannot just let religion be this decentralized, chaotic, organic thing. If the state's survival relies on the scholars, the state needs to organize and control the scholars.
Yes, and this leads us to what is perhaps the most defining feature of their governance: the total bureaucratization of faith.
Which is such a wild concept.
It is a massive departure from how religion operated in many other Islamic societies of the time. If you look at decentralized systems like the Mamluks in Egypt before the Ottomans conquered them, a scholar was largely an independent actor.
They just kind of did their own thing.
Pretty much. You became a scholar because you studied under another famous scholar, you gained a following, and you taught in a local mosque. Your authority was entirely based on your personal reputation and your network.
It was essentially a gig economy for theology.
Exactly. And the Ottomans looked at that decentralized, organic model and essentially said, no, that is entirely too unpredictable for a global empire. We need a rigid, predictable institution.
They turned religious scholarship into a state-salaried career path.
They absolutely did. They built an immense, strict religious hierarchy known as the Ilmai class.
The Ilmai class.
Yes. It was as structured as any modern military command.
Yeah.
You started at the bottom in local state-funded schools. If you excelled, you moved up to become a local judge or a teacher.
And then?
The best of those moved up to become regional appellate judges, up to the imperial court, and ultimately to the absolute pinnacle of the system.
The Sheikh al-Islam.
Yes. The Sheikh al-Islam was the highest religious authority in the empire.
It's almost like a chief justice of a Supreme Court, but for divine law.
That's a very accurate comparison.
And from what the sources say, the Sultan appointed him, but once in power, the Sheikh al-Islam had the theoretical authority to depose the Sultan if the Sultan blatantly violated the Sharia.
Right. There was a real tension there.
Yeah.
Sultan had the military, but the Sheikh al-Islam could pull the plug on his religious legitimacy.
It is a fascinating tension, but I want to pivot here, because if you are listening to this in a modern Western democracy, your immediate instinct is probably to view a state-funded, heavily bureaucratized religious hierarchy as inherently oppressive.
Oh, absolutely. We're very suspicious of that today.
Right. We're conditioned to think of state religion as a mechanism for pure thought control. Just guys in robes telling you what you can't do.
Yeah.
But the reality on the ground in the Ottoman Empire was entirely different. This top-down hierarchy physically manifested as a massive social safety net.
That is a crucial point to understand. This system wasn't just a bunch of austere men in robes arguing over legal texts in a palace. This religious bureaucracy dictated the actual physical architecture of daily life.
It built the cities.
Yes. Religion in the Ottoman Empire was not an abstract, private concept that you only thought about during Friday prayers. It was the physical infrastructure of the city.
Let's talk about the grand mosque complexes. When you or I picture a mosque today, we typically picture a beautiful, specialized building dedicated solely to prayer.
Right, a place of worship.
But places like the Blue Mosque or the massive Suleimani Mosque complex in Istanbul, they were not just prayer halls. They were sprawling civic centers. They were literally cities within cities.
And the mechanism that made this possible is the concept of the waqf.
The wax.
Yes. A waqf is a community charitable endowment, and it is governed by strict religious law. Wealthy individuals, high-ranking viziers, and the Sultan himself would take their private wealth and permanently endow it to build these complexes.
And what actually goes into one of these complexes? Because looking at the blueprints, it's staggering.
It really is. A major imperial waqf would center around the mosque, yes. But physically attached to it, you would have madrasas.
Which are the schools, right?
Exactly. The state-funded religious and scientific schools where the scholarly class was trained. You would also have fully staffed hospitals providing free medical care.
Free medical care in the 1500s.
Yes. And you would have massive soup kitchens, known as imarets, designed to feed hundreds of poor citizens, students, and travelers every single day.
And they had to pay for all of this. I mean, they didn't just rely on ongoing donations to keep the lights on.
No, they engineered the funding directly into the architecture.
Right. They built bustling commercial markets, public bathhouses, and caravanserais physically attached to the complex. The rental income and the fees generated by those commercial spaces were legally bound in perpetuity to pay the salaries of the doctors, the soup kitchen cooks, and the scholars.
Exactly. The money flowed directly from the commercial infrastructure into the social infrastructure. And this completely challenges the misconception that Ottoman Islam was purely a system of authoritarian punishment.
It flips it on its head.
It does. If we look at the core beliefs of their worldview, The purpose of human life was not just to sit in isolation and worship God. The purpose of life was to live according to divine law, and that fundamentally meant maintaining justice and equity in society.
So providing healthcare, offering free education, and feeding the poor, these were not seen as secular state welfare programs.
Well, not at all.
They were the literal physical enactment of faith. So yes, it was a highly top-down engineered system, but it was a top-down system designed to provide a cradle-to-grave social safety net.
Right.
The bureaucracy wasn't just there to tax you, it was there to catch you if you fell.
And that infrastructure creates incredible civic loyalty. When the state provides your education, heals your sickness, and feeds you when your crops fail, all in the name of the divine law. Well, the legitimacy of that state becomes unshakable.
Because it's materially taking care of you.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have decoded the exterior mechanics. We have a vast bureaucracy of soup kitchens, hospitals, and flexible canon laws keeping society fed, orderly, and economically viable.
The physical needs are met.
Right. The physical needs are met, and the civic order is maintained. But let's get deeply personal for a second.
Let's do it.
Because a brilliant tax code and a well-funded hospital do not comfort your soul in the dark of night. They do not answer the existential questions of human suffering. What keeps the individual believer spiritually fulfilled inside this massive machine?
That is the ultimate question.
And this brings us to the internal psychological worldview of the Ottoman Muslim, which is where this system shifts from being just clever to being profoundly wise.
This is where we examine the soul of the machine. To understand why this system lasted for over half a millennium, you really have to understand their specific psychological model of human nature.
Which was pretty complex, right?
Very. The Ottoman worldview saw humans as magnificent creations of God, imbued with deep moral responsibility. But they also recognized that human beings are fundamentally flawed and locked in a brutal, exhausting, lifelong internal struggle.
The struggle against the ego. The concept of the nafs.
Yes, the nafs. It's a central concept in Islamic psychology. It represents the lower self, the ego, the base appetites.
The part of you that just wants more, more, more.
Exactly. It's the source of greed, arrogance, moral corruption, and fundamentally the forgetfulness of God. In the Ottoman mindset, the greatest threat to the empire wasn't necessarily the army of a neighboring kingdom.
It was internal.
Yes. The greatest threat was the arrogance that makes a judge take a bribe, the greed that makes a merchant cheat his customers, or the pride that makes a sultan launch an unjust war.
The empire collapses if the nafs is left unchecked. So how do you fight a war against human nature at scale? Because it seems like the Ottomans built an entire multi-layered cultural toolkit specifically designed for this internal warfare.
They did.
They didn't just tell people to be good. They provided 4 distinct institutionalized paths to keep the ego in check.
It was a highly structured approach to human development. First, there's the path of discipline.
Okay, discipline.
This is the baseline. It is achieved through strictly adhering to the Sharia and observing the ritual requirements, like the 5 daily prayers. It physically and mentally habituates the believer to submission to a higher authority.
Right. It breaks the arrogance of the body. You have to stop what you're doing, bow, and put your forehead on the ground.
Exactly. You physically lower yourself. Second, you have the path of knowledge.
Knowledge.
This is the intellectual pursuit. It involves rigorous scholarship, studying the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, and the complex legal theories we discussed earlier. It's about aligning the intellect with divine truth.
So body then mind.
Right. Third, there is the path of service. This connects back to the walks and the hospitals. It is the active, outward application of faith through maintaining justice, participating in ethical governance, and providing charity.
So outward action. And then there is the 4th path. And this is the one that completely shatters our modern expectations of what a rigid militaristic empire looks like. The 4th path is devotion. And they achieve this specifically through the widespread integration of Sufi mysticism.
The total embrace and institutionalization of Sufism is arguably one of the most uniquely defining characteristics of Ottoman Imperial Islam.
Because usually empires don't like mystics.
Right. If you look at certain modern religious movements today, they often strictly reject mysticism. They view it as an unorthodox innovation, a corruption of the pure text.
Too weird, too emotional.
Exactly. But the Ottomans viewed it entirely differently. They completely embraced it. They did not see the strict legalism of the Sharia and the emotional mysticism of Sufism as enemies.
They saw them as teammates.
Yes. They saw them as absolutely complementary necessities for human sanity.
This is where we need to unpack the mechanics of how this actually worked in society, because the examples in the sources are incredible. You have major Sufi traditions woven seamlessly into the daily life of the empire.
They were everywhere.
Take the Mevlevi order. It's probably the most famous globally. Today, people know them primarily for the whirling dervishes, but that wasn't just a performance, right?
No, not at all. It was a deeply sophisticated, poetic spirituality focused on inner purification, the shedding of the ego, and achieving a state of ecstatic love for God.
But the physical act of whirling itself, what is the significance there?
Well, the physical act of whirling is a moving meditation. The dancer has one hand pointed up to receive divine grace and one hand pointed down to distribute it to the earth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a physical manifestation of the individual acting as a conduit between heaven and the material world. And this order wasn't a fringe cult. It was heavily patronized by the elites.
Even the sultans, right?
Many sultans were active members of the Mevlevi order. They composed exquisite mystical poetry under pen names.
Which is just wild to think about. I mean, imagine the same sultan who is signing a decree to execute a corrupt governor is retreating to his chambers at night to write poetry about the annihilation of the ego in the ocean of divine love.
It was quite the contrast.
It really is. But if the Mevlevi order represents the artistic elite side of this mysticism, the Bektashi order represents something else entirely. And this is where the integration of mysticism gets truly fascinating.
The Bektashi order is one of the most remarkable phenomena in Ottoman history. They were a more heterodox, incredibly inclusive Sufi order. But their primary historical significance is their intimate, institutionalized connection with the Ottoman military.
Specifically, the elite Janissary Corps.
Yes.
Let's linger on this because it is the ultimate paradox. The Janissaries were the most feared, highly disciplined infantry in the world at that time.
Absolutely terrifying on the battlefield.
They were originally drawn from Christian populations through a levy system, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be the Sultan's elite shock troops.
And so, how do you ensure the absolute unshakable loyalty of a military force entirely separated from their original families?
You give them a new family.
Exactly. You give them a new family, a new spiritual father, and a deeply binding internal ethos. The Janissaries formally adopted the founder of the Bektashi order as their spiritual patron.
Wait, so the dervishes were actually with them?
Yes. The Bektashi dervishes actually marched with the Janissary armies. They provided spiritual counseling, they led prayers before battles, and their inclusive, deeply emotional brand of mysticism provided a powerful psychological anchor for men whose entire lives were consumed by warfare.
I am going to try an analogy here to capture how bizarre and brilliant this is to a modern mindset.
Let's hear it.
Imagine having a ruthlessly strict personal trainer who dictates every single calorie you consume and every movement you make. That is the law, the Sharia, keeping your external actions perfectly disciplined.
Okay, keeping you in shape.
Right. But simultaneously, you have an empathetic therapist and a master poet on speed dial to process your deepest emotional trauma and existential dread. That is the Sufi mysticism addressing your internal state.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
To see a massive, militaristic imperial state actively promote both rigid behavioral conformity and deep mystical emotional exploration is staggering.
It reveals a profound, layered understanding of sociology and psychology. The Ottoman architectural blueprint for society was essentially this. The law governs behavior and maintains public order.
Check.
The scholarship interprets scripture and maintains intellectual rigor.
Check.
But the mysticism transforms the soul and prevents the system from becoming a hollow tyranny. Their perspective was that a healthy civilization and a healthy human mind absolutely required all three working in concert.
Because if you lose one, the whole thing falls apart.
Right. If you only have rigid law, society becomes brittle, hollow, and oppressive. If you only have mysticism, you lose the practical civic order required to run an economy. They believed they had engineered the perfect equilibrium.
Okay, so this perfect internal equilibrium of law, scholarship, and spirit creates an incredibly confident, stable, in-group identity. The Ottoman Sunni Muslim knew exactly who they were, what their purpose was, and how their society functioned.
Yes, very secure in their identity.
But history tells us that empires are ultimately defined by how they manage their outgroups. The Ottomans weren't just ruling over Muslims. As they expanded rapidly into Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, they absorbed millions of non-Muslims.
Millions of them.
How did this supremely confident, religiously grounded empire handle the millions of Christians and Jews they suddenly ruled over.
They implemented what is known as the millet system.
Mhm.
And in the context of the 15th and 16th centuries, it was a revolutionary, highly pragmatic concept of governance.
Because the standard operating procedure for empires back then was usually, convert or die.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Ottomans were brilliant administrators. They recognized immediately that attempting to force millions of Orthodox Christians, Armenians, and Jews to convert to Islam would be logistically impossible, economically disastrous, and endlessly destabilizing.
It would just be a never-ending religious war inside their own borders. You can't run an economy if half your cities are constantly revolting.
Right. So they leaned on established Islamic legal precedent. Under Islamic law, these groups, Christians, Jews, and others, were classified as dhimmis, which means protected minority groups.
But the millet system went way beyond just saying, we won't kill you.
Yeah.
They weren't just tolerated in a passive sense. The mechanism of the millet system granted them a staggering amount of autonomy.
Yes, it did.
Mm.
The term millet essentially translates to nation or religious community. Under this system, the empire organized its non-Muslim subjects not by geography, but by their religious affiliation.
So it didn't matter what city you lived in.
Right. There was an Orthodox Christian millet, an Armenian millet, a Jewish millet, and so on. And the state allowed each of these communities to govern their own internal affairs under their own religious laws.
Let's break down how that actually functioned on the ground, because it is fascinating. If you are a Greek Orthodox Christian living in Istanbul or a Jewish merchant living in Salonika, and you have a dispute over a marriage contract or an inheritance or a business deal with someone in your own community, you do not go to the local Islamic Sharia court.
No, you do not. You go to your own community's court.
Wow.
The Orthodox Christian goes to a court overseen by the Greek patriarch. The Jewish merchant goes to a rabbinical court. The state entirely outsourced internal civil law for these minorities.
And what about the community leaders?
The leaders of these communities, the patriarchs and the chief rabbis, were given official state authority. They were responsible for collecting taxes from their communities and handing them over to the Ottoman state.
And in return?
In exchange, they were left alone to manage their own schools, their own places of worship, and their own civil laws.
They paid a special tax, right? The jizya.
Yes, the jizya. It was for this protection and for exemption from military service.
Right. And the state only stepped in if there was a criminal issue involving state security or if a dispute crossed community lines, like a Christian suing a Muslim. In those cases, it went to the Islamic courts. This pragmatism made the Ottoman Empire one of the most religiously diverse, economically dynamic states of its time. I mean, it provided a safe haven for groups like the Sephardic Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition.
It was an incredible engine for economic growth because it allowed diverse merchant networks to thrive within a stable legal framework.
Okay, but I have to put my strategist hat on here and strongly push back.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you are an expanding, ambitious empire, and you deliberately give minority groups their own legal autonomy, their own courts, their own community leaders, and their own tax-collecting infrastructure, aren't you just planting the seeds for your own destruction?
It sounds risky.
Aren't you basically building little independent states within your borders? How did they not see that these communities would eventually use that very infrastructure to rebel and fracture the empire?
It is a highly logical critique. And it is exactly the anxiety that drives modern nation-states to enforce strict, homogeneous cultural assimilation.
Right. Everyone must speak the same language and use the same courts.
But the Ottoman political philosophy viewed the mechanics of stability completely differently. Their absolute top priority was the preservation of order. To them, the millet system was not a sign of weakness or a dangerous concession.
What was it then?
It was a highly calculated, deeply cynical, and brilliantly effective strategy for neutralizing internal threats.
Wait, how does giving them autonomy neutralize the threat?
Well, think about the root cause of most rebellions. It is usually the friction of daily life, the state interfering with the community's language, their deeply held religious rituals, or their family structures.
Like trying to force someone to change their marriage customs.
Exactly. By granting internal religious tolerance and legal autonomy, the Ottomans completely removed that daily friction. If an Orthodox community feels that their way of life, their church, and their property are secure, their motivation to launch the suicidal revolt against the Sultan dropped to near zero.
You outsource the friction of daily governance to the community leaders. If a Christian peasant is angry about an inheritance ruling, he is angry at his own patriarch, not the Ottoman Sultan.
Precisely. You redirect internal grievances. And by ensuring internal peace, the empire freed up its most valuable resource, its military.
Because they didn't have to keep the peace at home.
Right. They were not wasting tens of thousands of janissaries garrisoning their own cities, trying to police the religious beliefs of their subjects. They were taking that massive military machine and sending it to the borders to fight their actual existential rival states.
So they sent them west to fight the Habsburg monarchy in Europe.
And they sent them east to fight the Safavid Empire in Persia.
That is the perfect pivot because it reveals a fascinating historical irony in the sources. While the Ottomans were famously pragmatic and tolerant of Christians and Jews internally, their most intense, bitter, existential friction was actually with other Muslims.
Yes.
Specifically, the Shiite Safavid Empire on their eastern border.
The geopolitical rivalry with the Safavids deeply intensified the theological differences between Sunni and Shiite Islam. The Ottomans viewed themselves as the pinnacle and the protectors of Sunni orthodoxy, and they felt acutely threatened by the rapid rise of the Shia Safavids right on their doorstep.
We need to do a deep dive into the mechanics of this divergence, because understanding the Ottoman Sunni model requires understanding what they were defining themselves against.
Absolutely.
Let's break down the structural differences between Ottoman Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam. And to do that, we have to trace it all the way back to the very beginning, right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, regarding the fundamental question of leadership.
That is the root of the entire divergence. The Ottoman Sunni position is fundamentally pragmatic. They believe that the leadership of the Muslim community should go to the most capable, qualified leader selected by the consensus of the community.
So merit-based, essentially.
Yes. This concept produced the institution of the caliph. The caliph is not a prophet. He does not receive divine revelation. He is a political, military, and administrative executive whose primary job is to protect the borders of Islam and enforce the Sharia.
And eventually, the Ottoman sultans claimed this title of caliph for themselves to solidify their global authority.
They did. But the Shiite position on leadership is entirely different. It is not about pragmatic community selection.
It's about divine lineage.
Exactly. The Shiite tradition believes that leadership of the community is a matter of divine appointment, and it must stay within the family of the prophet. Specifically, it traces through his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his direct descendants.
And these leaders are the imams.
Yes, these leaders are known as the imams. In Shiite theology, the imam is not just a political administrator. He possesses profound, divinely guided spiritual authority to interpret the inner meanings of the faith.
And this difference in how leadership is defined creates a massive difference in how religious authority is structured on the ground.
It ripples through everything.
In the Ottoman Sunni model, as we discussed, authority is horizontally distributed among the scholars. There is no single infallible human leader who dictates theology. It is a pluralistic system. The scholars collectively debate, interpret the Quran and the Hadith, and rely on centuries of legal precedent to reach a consensus.
Whereas in Shiite Islam, specifically Twelver Shiism, which became the state religion of the Safavid Empire and is the largest branch today, spiritual authority flows directly through that sacred line of 12 imams.
So it's much more centralized.
Because of that focus on a centralized, sacred figure, Shiite clerics eventually developed a much more powerful, formalized, and independent religious hierarchy tied to the concept of acting on behalf of the hidden imam.
Let's look at how this shapes their historical identities, because the emotional resonance is completely different. For the Ottomans, their entire historical narrative was focused on victory.
Right, winning.
It was the triumph and the unity of the Ummah, the global Muslim community. They saw themselves as the successful inheritors of an unbroken, victorious tradition spanning centuries. God favors them, which is why their empire stretches across 3 continents.
But the Shiite historical identity is anchored in a profoundly different emotional reality. It is anchored in tragedy.
Specifically, the tragedy of the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century.
Yes, where Hussein ibn Ali, the Prophet's grandson, was massacred along with his family and supporters by the forces of the Umayyad Caliphate.
This event is the absolute emotional core of Shiite identity. It symbolizes the ultimate resistance to tyranny. It represents the willing acceptance of martyrdom in the pursuit of divine justice against corrupt worldly rulers.
Right, and it creates a religious life that incorporates deep public commemorations, emotional poetry, and ritual mourning, particularly during the observance of Ashura.
And if you extrapolate those 2 different emotional histories, you arrive at 2 radically different political philosophies.
You really do.
The Ottomans, focused on victory and the unity of the Ummah, developed a political theory that deeply valued stability above almost everything else. Their philosophical baseline was, you must tolerate even an imperfect, corrupt, or harsh ruler, because the alternative civil war, chaos, and the breakdown of the Sharia is infinitely worse.
Keep the machine running at all costs. The individual might suffer under a bad sultan, but the community survives.
Precisely. But the Shiite tradition, born from the ultimate injustice at Karbala, historically developed a much more structurally oppositional attitude toward worldly power.
If legitimate infallible leadership inherently belongs only to the imams, then by definition, any worldly political ruler who claims power in their absence is viewed with a degree of deep skepticism.
Right.
The Shiite worldview is continually oriented toward the pursuit of rightful divine justice and structurally suspicious of the state.
I want to make a really critical clarification here because when we talk about Sunni and Shiite divides today, we are heavily influenced by the hyperpolarized, violent sectarianism of the modern Middle East.
Yes, we project a lot onto the past.
It is very easy to project that backward and assume the Ottomans and Safavids were just constantly slaughtering each other purely over theology, but the historical reality on the ground was much more complex.
Very much so.
In the local markets of Baghdad or the trade routes of Anatolia, every day Ottoman Sunni Muslims and Shiites interacted constantly. They traded together, they lived in the same neighborhoods, and they frequently intermarried across sectarian lines.
That is a vital nuance. The sharp, violent, zero-sum divide was heavily engineered from the top down. It was driven by the massive geopolitical rivalry between the Ottoman and Safavid states.
The politicians using religion again.
Exactly. When the Ottomans and Safavids clashed at massive battles like Chaldiran in 1514, it was a clash of empires fighting for control of the Middle East and its trade routes. But to motivate their armies and secure the absolute loyalty of their populations, both empires weaponized theology.
They turned a border dispute into a holy war.
The state amplified the sectarian differences to turn a geopolitical conflict into a cosmic war between orthodoxy and heresy.
It is the classic imperial playbook. Use religion to solidify the borders of the state. To further understand the specific flavor of Ottoman Islam, I think it is really helpful to look at how it is critiqued today by another major modern movement, Salafism, or reformist Islam.
Ah, yes.
Because modern Salafists look back at the Ottoman Empire and they do not see a glorious golden age. They see a system deeply compromised by innovation.
Yes, the Salafi critique is a fascinating contrast that highlights exactly what made the Ottoman system unique. Modern Salafi movements are fundamentally puritanical. They advocate for a direct, unmediated return to the original texts, the Quran, and the practices of the earliest generations of Muslims.
So no added layers.
Right. When they look back at the Ottoman synthesis, they critique it harshly. They argue that Ottoman Islam became bloated and corrupted by local cultural traditions.
By all those overly complex Hanafi legal gymnastics we talked about?
Exactly. That strayed from the literal text by political compromises and especially by the total integration of Sufism, which Salafists generally reject as un-Islamic.
So the Salafi argument is basically, you layered 600 years of bureaucratic rust and mystical poetry over the pure faith, and we need to strip it all away.
That's a good summary.
How would the classic Ottoman scholars defend their system against that specific critique?
The Ottoman defense is deeply tied to their absolute reverence for institutional scholarship and the concept of ijma.
Ijma.
Yes, which means scholarly consensus. The Ottoman scholars would argue that you cannot simply jump over 1,000 years of intellectual history and claim to have a pure reading of a 7th century text.
You can't just ignore the experts who spent centuries studying it.
Right. They believed that the long, unbroken chain of intellectual authority, generations upon generations of brilliant scholars debating, refining, and applying the law to changing circumstances, was not a corruption. It was a mechanism of protection.
They trusted the process.
They believed that consensus protected the faith from chaotic, radical, or highly individualistic interpretations. To the Ottomans, tradition was a fortress.
A fortress.
It absorbed the shocks of history, incorporated the emotional needs of the population through Sufism, and maintained a stable society. They would argue that stripping away that tradition doesn't leave you with a pure faith. It leaves you with a brittle, highly volatile ideology that lacks the flexibility to actually govern human beings.
So if we pull all of this together, we are looking at a meticulously engineered, seemingly indestructible system. You have the ulama guarding the divine law.
Yep.
The Sufi mystics feeding the emotional soul,
Right.
the Sultan issuing flexible kanun to manage the economy, the massive wax system providing social welfare, the millet system keeping minority communities stable, and a highly confident Sunni imperial identity anchoring the entire structure.
It's an incredible machine.
It sounds like the perfect society. So why did it eventually collapse?
Well, because no system, no matter how brilliantly balanced, can remain isolated from the shifting tectonic plates of global history.
The world outside kept moving.
Exactly. The decline of the Ottoman Empire was not an overnight collapse. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling, driven by a combination of immense external pressures and internal obsolescence.
External pressures like Europe.
Yes. First, you had the rise of aggressive, industrialized European colonial powers. As Europe modernized its economies and militaries, the Ottomans found themselves constantly pushed onto the defensive, losing territory in the Balkans, North Africa, and the Caucasus.
But the truly fatal blow wasn't just foreign armies. It was a foreign idea.
Nationalism.
Yes, the explosion of modern nationalism.
Exactly. The very concept of the modern nation-state. The idea that every ethnic and linguistic group deserves its own sovereign territory was a lethal poison to the fabric of a multi-ethnic empire.
The millet system just wasn't built for that.
No, the millet system, which had kept the empire stable for centuries by organizing people by religion, was entirely unequipped to handle a world where people suddenly wanted to be organized by ethnicity and language.
The Greek Orthodox Christian no longer just wanted religious autonomy within the empire. He wanted an independent Greek nation.
Right.
The Bulgarians wanted a Bulgarian nation. The Arab provinces wanted independence from Turkish rule.
And the Ottomans recognized this existential threat. They didn't just sit back and watch the empire dissolve. In the 19th century, they attempted massive, desperate modernization efforts known as the Tanzimat reforms.
Let's look at the mechanics of the Tanzimat because it represents the ultimate stress test of the Ottoman operating system. They realized the old ways weren't working, so they tried to drastically update the bureaucracy.
They centralized the military along European lines.
And they tried to rewrite the legal codes to promote a new secular concept of citizenship called Osmanlik, or Ottomanism.
Yeah.
The goal was to make everyone Muslim, Christian, Jew equal citizens of the state, rather than subjects divided by their religious millets.
But the tragedy of the Tanzimat reforms is that they attempted to graft a secular European concept of citizenship onto an entirely Islamic architectural blueprint.
Like installing an update that bricks the whole system.
Exactly. It alienated the traditional religious scholars who felt the Sharia was being bypassed. It failed to satisfy the nationalist aspirations of the minorities who simply wanted their own countries. And it placed an unbearable financial strain on the state.
Center couldn't hold.
The internal contradictions became too great, and the pressures of global conflict finally shattered the machine. The empire suffered devastating losses in the Balkan Wars, entered World War I on the losing side, and was finally officially dissolved in 1922, paving the way for the modern Republic of Turkey.
But here is the most fascinating part of the story. While the political empire collapsed, the psychological worldview, that deep internal architecture we discussed, did not just evaporate when the Sultan boarded a ship into exile.
It survived in the minds of the people.
This brings us back to what it actually felt like to live inside the system. If you step out of the macro history and step into the shoes of the everyday believer, you realize that this was never just a political allegiance. It was a total, encompassing framework for making sense of the universe.
Imagine the psychological reality of waking up in that world. Your daily rhythm is not dictated by the brutal clock of modern capitalism. It is punctuated by the call to prayer, echoing across the city 5 times a day.
Beautiful.
You attend a neighborhood mosque that is not just a building, but the beating heart of your community's healthcare, education, and social life. You find profound, unshakable meaning in serving God, maintaining the honor of your family, and contributing to what you genuinely believe is a fundamentally just, divinely sanctioned society.
And your anxieties are completely different. Your greatest fears aren't just missing a mortgage payment or facing a recession. Your deepest existential fears are the fear of dishonoring your lineage, violating the divine law, and succumbing to the nafs suffering internal spiritual corruption.
Faith, in the Ottoman context, provided an incredibly robust framework for discipline, belonging, and purpose. It effectively neutralized the modern plague of alienation.
Everyone had a place.
It gave every single individual, from the highest vizier to the lowest street vendor, a highly specific, meaningful place in both a cosmic and a civic order.
And the echoes of that order are still visible everywhere, more than a century after the empire fell. You see it physically in modern Turkish mosque architecture, which still heavily favors the grand, soaring Ottoman domes and needle-like minarets.
You absolutely do.
You see it in how the modern Turkish state still attempts to manage and bureaucratize religion through institutions like the Diyanet.
Yeah.
And crucially, you see it in the intellectual world. Many contemporary Muslim political movements, scholars, and historians constantly look back to the Ottoman era.
They study it religiously, no pun intended.
Right. They study its governance, its legal flexibility, and its wax systems as a historical masterclass in how to build a functioning, thriving Islamic civilization in an incredibly complex, pluralistic world.
It remains the most powerful historical proof of concept for a society that successfully, pragmatically integrated the demands of religious law with the harsh realities of global statecraft.
It really is staggering when you step back and look at the sheer scale of the achievement. We were talking about a 600-year balancing act. They managed to take the absolute unyielding nature of divine law, pair it with the profound emotional depth of mystical devotion, and wrap the entire thing in the pragmatic, flexible, highly bureaucratic administration needed to run a global economy.
It is a breathtaking piece of civilizational engineering.
It truly is. And examining it leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over, drawing on the deepest strategic questions of how human beings organize themselves.
Question for today.
Exactly. Today, in our modern secularized world, we often operate under a strict baseline assumption. We assume that strong, centralized, pragmatic civic governance and deep, mystical, all-encompassing spiritual devotion are fundamentally mutually exclusive.
We tend to believe that you can only have one or the other, and that if you try to combine them, one must inevitably consume or destroy the other.
We assume that secularism is the only way to run a modern state.
Right. But the Ottoman experiment, lasting 6 centuries, forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question regarding our own society.
Which is?
Is our modern separation of the spiritual from the civic actually a sign of inevitable human progress? Or have we simply lost the architectural blueprint for how to successfully combine them?
Wow. What an incredibly powerful question to end on. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you a completely new lens through which to view history, the mechanics of governance, and the profound complexities of faith. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep exploring the past, and we will see you next time as we open up the next puzzle.